The framing is backward. Here's something almost nobody says out loud. Quitting your job is not brave. Staying is not weak. You've probably heard it the other way around your whole working life. The person who walks away from a bad situation gets called courageous, and the person who sticks it out gets called either loyal or foolish, depending on who's telling the story. Flip that assumption over and look at the underside of it, and it falls apart almost immediately. Because Braw's bravery was never the right measurement to begin with. The question that actually decides whether you should quit or stay has nothing to do with how brave either option makes you look. It's this: can you name your problem specifically enough that you could actually test it, not vent about it, not feel it in your stomach on Sunday night? Name it in a sentence, precisely enough that you'd know if it changed. Most people can't do that, and that's not a character flaw. It's because two very well-documented mental biases are working against them at exactly the moment they need clear thinking the most. One makes staying feel like the responsible choice, even when it isn't. The other makes leaving feel like an obvious upgrade, even when it might not be. Both are lying to you in different directions, and you are standing right in the middle, trying to make a decision that will shape the next several years of your life. So let's take this apart properly. Not stay versus leave as a moral contest. Stay versus leave as two real paths, each with real costs, each capable of being the right call, depending on facts you can actually check. That's the whole episode. Two paths laid side by side, no thumb on the scale. The sunk cost trap. Start with the bias that keeps people stuck in jobs that are genuinely broken. It's called the sunk cost fallacy, and it comes out of behavioral economics, most famously associated with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on loss aversion, the idea that losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. Here's how it shows up at your desk. You've put 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years into this job. You know the systems, you know the people. You've earned whatever standing you have. And some part of your brain has quietly converted all of that time into an investment. And investments are supposed to pay off, not get abandoned. So when the job turns out to be genuinely broken, walking away doesn't feel like a decision anymore. It feels like admitting the investment was a mistake. It feels like the years were wasted. And nobody wants to be the person who wasted years. Here's the part that breaks the whole logic open, though. Those years are gone either way. Whether you stay for 2 more or leave tomorrow, the time you already spent cannot be recovered by either choice. It is, by definition, sunk. The only thing that should matter for a decision made today is what happens from today forward, not what you've already paid. But that's not how it feels, and feelings are persuasive. So sunk cost quietly recruits your own history as a hostage and uses it to argue for staying, regardless of whether staying is actually good for you. It doesn't care if the job is right. It only cares about protecting the story that your past effort meant something. And the cruel irony is that the people who've invested the most, the ones who've given the job the most years, the most loyalty, the most extra hours, are exactly the ones this bias grips the hardest. The more you've paid, the harder it pulls. If sunk cost were the only force at work, you'd expect people to at least err towards staying too long, consistently, in one predictable direction. But there's a second bias running in the opposite direction, and it's just as strong. The grass is greener trap. This one is the mirror image, and it's worth understanding precisely, because it cancels out the first bias, just enough to leave people stuck in the middle, unable to move either way with any confidence. Here's the asymmetry. Your current job you have lived in. You know it's bad Mondays, it's passive-aggressive Slack messages, it's one manager who never quite follows through. You've experienced the full range, the good weeks and the terrible ones, because you were there for all of it. A new job, the one you're imagining, you have not lived in yet. You've seen a job posting, maybe a LinkedIn profile of someone who works there, maybe a friend's secondhand story about how great the culture is. That's it. That's the entire evidence base. And what your mind does with a thin, incomplete evidence base is fill in the blanks, usually with the best case version, because there's no lived contradiction yet to argue against it. So you end up comparing two things that were never comparable in the first place. Your current job, judged by its full range, including its worst days. The new job, judged by its highlight reel, because the highlight reel is all you've got. Of course, the new job wins that comparison. It was never a fair fight. This is a known and studied asymmetry in how people evaluate the familiar against the unfamiliar. Known things get judged by their complete range of experience, and imagined things get judged by whatever fragment of a picture is easiest to construct, which tends to be the flattering fragment. It's not that the new job is definitely worse than it looks. It might genuinely be better. The problem is that you have no way of knowing that yet, and the bias makes you feel like you already do. Put these two forces side by side for a second. Sunk cost pulls you toward staying, using your own past investment as leverage. Grass is greener pulls you toward leaving, using an unearned, rose-tinted picture of the alternative. Neither one is reasoning about your actual situation. Both are reasoning about a story your mind finds comfortable, which raises the obvious next question. If you can't trust either pull, what can you actually check? Bad week versus bad structure. Here's the diagnostic that cuts through both biases, because it doesn't ask you how you feel about the job. It asks what kind of problem you actually have. There are two categories, and they look similar from the inside, but they are not the same thing at all. A bad patch is temporary and situational. Your manager is new and still learning how to manage. One quarter was brutal because of a product launch or a reorg, and it's not going to be brutal every quarter. Personal stress from outside work is bleeding into how you experience your job, and the job itself hasn't actually changed. You have less capacity to absorb the normal friction right now. All of these are real, and all of them are painful, and none of them are permanent features of the job. They're weather. Weather passes. A structural mismatch does not pass. It repeats, despite your own effort to fix it. You've raised the same complaint in 2 or more review cycles, and nothing has actually moved. Same conversation, same nodding, same nothing changing 6 months later. There's a ceiling on your growth that has nothing to do with your performance. You're good at the job. Everyone agrees you're good at the job, and there is simply no next level available here, no matter how good you get. That's not weather. That's the architecture of the role itself. So here's the actual test, the one thing worth writing down before you make any decision. Has this exact problem persisted, unchanged, through at least one full performance cycle, after you have actually raised it out loud to the person who could do something about it, not privately resented it, raised it? If the answer is yes, full cycle, real conversation, zero movement, you're looking at structure, not weather. If you haven't actually raised it yet, or it's been a matter of weeks rather than a full cycle, you may not have enough information to know which one you're dealing with. And that distinction is the hinge the rest of this episode swings on. What staying and fighting for it looks like when it works. Let's say the diagnostic points toward maybe this is fixable. What does staying actually look like when it's the right call, done well, not just endured? It's not gritting your teeth and waiting for the feeling to pass. Staying that works is active, not passive. It looks like requesting an internal transfer to a team where the actual friction, a bad manager, a mismatched role, simply isn't present anymore, while keeping the tenure and institutional trust you've already built. It looks like renegotiating scope directly with your manager, walking in and saying, specifically, this part of my role is draining me and isn't the best use of what I'm good at. Here's what I'd propose instead. It looks like naming the actual root cause out loud, to the person who can act on it, instead of the two default alternatives almost everyone reaches for. Enduring it silently while resentment compounds, or job hunting silently while pretending everything's fine in every meeting. Notice the pattern in all three of those. Each one is a move. Something you did, out loud, to someone who has the power to change something. That's the entire distinguishing feature of staying that works. It costs you something up front, a slightly uncomfortable conversation, a formal ask, a moment of visible vulnerability, in exchange for actual information about whether the structure can flex. Compare that to just staying, which brings us to the version of staying that isn't a strategy at all. What staying looks like when it's actually avoidance. Here's the harder one to see from the inside, because it wears the same clothes as loyalty. Avoidance staying feels, from within, like patience, like commitment, like being the reliable one. From outside, it looks like familiarity mistaken for a virtue and fear of the unknown wearing a disguise. Nobody sits down and consciously decides, I will now disengage from my job while pretending everything's fine. It happens gradually, one unraised concern at a time, until showing up and doing the minimum required becomes the whole relationship. There's actually a well-documented, visible symptom of exactly this pattern, tracked for years across the workforce in Gallup's ongoing workplace engagement research. The rise of what's often called quiet quitting, employees who are technically present, technically doing the job, and functionally checked out of any real investment in the outcome. That's not a personal failing unique to any one person. It's what staying past the point of genuine investment looks like at scale, across millions of people, which should tell you something. It's a predictable output of a specific set of conditions, not a rare character flaw. The test for telling these two apart isn't how long you've been unhappy. It's whether you've made a move. Fighting for it involves a conversation someone else can respond to. Avoidance involves silence someone else can't even see. If your version of staying has been entirely internal, no transfer request, no scope conversation, no root cause named to anyone with power to act on it, that's worth sitting with honestly, because avoidance doesn't fix anything. It just delays the version of this conversation you're eventually going to have with yourself anyway, usually at a worse moment than now. What leaving actually fixes, and what it doesn't. Say the diagnostic points the other way. Real structure, not weather. And you've already made the moves, and nothing gave. What does leaving actually buy you? It resets the external stuff cleanly. A bad manager is no longer your manager. A toxic team is no longer your team. A role that's genuinely capped, no next level, no matter how good you get, is no longer the ceiling over your head. Those are real, structural problems, and a new employer genuinely removes them. That part is not an illusion. Here's what it doesn't reset, though, and this is the part that trips people up the hardest. Leaving does not reset you. If you're someone who overfunctions, quietly picking up slack, nobody asked you to pick up, until it becomes expected, you will do that at the next job too, because it's a pattern that lives in you, not in the org chart. If you avoid conflict, you'll avoid it with a new manager just as fluently as you avoided it with this one. If you chase approval, there will be a new person whose approval you chase, and the chasing will feel exactly as exhausting in 6 months as it does right now. Same rider, different horse. The horse changes. The way you ride does not, unless you've actually done something to change it. And a resignation letter isn't that something. This is where the two traps from earlier quietly reappear. If you're not careful, if your problem is genuinely external, bad manager, capped role, toxic team, leaving is the correct move, and no amount of internal work fixes an external structural problem. But if your problem is a pattern you carry, leaving alone won't touch it, and you'll be having a strangely familiar conversation with yourself in 18 months, in a new office, wondering why it feels the same. The timing check before you leave. Before any of this becomes a real decision instead of a hypothetical one, there's a timing question worth asking honestly, and it has nothing to do with investment advice. This is strictly a decision quality check. Is this decision being made from data you've gathered over weeks, watching a real pattern hold steady? Or is it being made from the emotional peak of one especially bad day? The day your manager embarrassed you in a meeting, the day a project you cared about got killed, the day everything felt unbearable at once. Both can lead to the same conclusion. Only one of them is reliable enough to build a decision on. And alongside that, do you actually have enough runway to make this choice from a position of information rather than desperation? Savings that give you room to breathe. A notice period you can actually honor without burning a bridge. Something resembling a plan for what comes next, even a rough one. None of that is about picking stocks or timing markets. It's about whether the decision is being driven by the actual facts of the job, or by how urgent it feels to escape a feeling. A good decision made from a place of information looks the same on paper, whether you make it on a Tuesday or wait 3 more weeks. A decision made from one bad day rarely survives contact with the following Tuesday. The two questions that actually separate the paths. Here's where all of it collapses down into something usable, one comparative test built for exactly this fork. Instead of an endless pro and con list that never resolves anything. 2 questions. Ask them together, not separately. Question 1. If this specific problem does not change in 6 months, will you regret having stayed? Not will it be annoying, regret. The kind that sits with you. Question 2. If you left tomorrow, is this the kind of problem that would follow you to the next job? Not, would the company be different? Would you be different, carrying this exact pattern into the next building? Here's why the two together do something neither one does alone. If the answer to question 1 is yes, and the answer to question 2 is no, this problem is genuinely external, and staying costs you real regret. That points toward leaving, clearly. If the answer to question 2 is yes, this is a pattern that rides with you regardless of address, then leaving alone solves nothing, and the actual work is internal, whichever building you're sitting in while you do it. Run both questions honestly, in that order, and you'll usually find the fork was clearer than the fog made it feel. A composite portrait. Picture someone, not a real person, an illustrative composite built from a pattern that shows up constantly 2 years into a role. Not catastrophic. Not the worst job story you've ever heard. Just resentful, in a low simmer, the kind that doesn't have a single dramatic incident attached to it, just an accumulation. Ask them how the job is, and they'll say, "It's not that bad," almost defensively, like the phrase itself is doing some protective work. And here's the detail that makes this composite worth sitting with. They've had the exact same conversation with themselves, alone, on a Sunday night, for roughly a year. Should I quit? Should I stick it out? Round and round, no new information entering the loop, no conclusion ever reached. This is what the two biases look like when they combine instead of canceling out. Sunk cost says 2 years is too much to walk away from. Grass is greener whispers that somewhere else is probably better, without offering any evidence either way. Neither one wins, so neither decision gets made, and the Sunday night conversation just repeats, identical, week after week. What breaks the loop isn't more time thinking about it. It's the diagnostic from earlier. Has this exact complaint survived a full cycle after being raised out loud? And the two questions, asked together, honestly. The composite doesn't need more feelings about the job. They need the actual test run once for real. Both costs are real. Before any recap, one thing has to be said plainly, because it's easy to let an episode like this quietly tilt toward one answer without meaning to. Leaving too soon has a real cost. You never build the specific skill of working through something hard instead of exiting at the first sign of friction. And that skill, The ability to sit inside a difficult situation and actually improve it is one you'll need again at the next job and the one after that. There's also a practical cost. A resume with a string of short stays starts to read, fairly or not, as flight risk to whoever's evaluating it next. Staying too long has an equally real cost, just a quieter one. Years spent adapting to a ceiling instead of finding or building a way past it. Skills that plateau instead of compound, because the environment stopped stretching you long ago and you stopped noticing. That cost doesn't show up as a single bad day. It shows up as a sudden realization, years later, of how much runway got spent standing still. Neither of these costs is hypothetical, and neither is bigger or smaller than the other in some universal sense. It depends entirely on which one actually applies to your specific situation. The point of laying them side by side isn't to nudge you toward the safer-sounding option. It's to make sure whichever way you go, you're choosing it with your eyes open to what it actually costs, not just what it promises. Recap and close. So here's the whole shape of it, back to front. The frame everyone starts with: quitting is brave, staying is weak, or the reverse, was wrong from the beginning. The real question is whether you can name your problem specifically enough to test it. Two biases work against that clarity from opposite directions. Sunk cost uses your own past investment to argue for staying, regardless of whether staying is good for you. Grass is greener compares your fully lived-in current job against an imagined highlight reel of somewhere else, a comparison that was never fair to begin with. The test that cuts through both of them is simple. Has this exact problem survived a full performance cycle after you've actually raised it out loud? If yes, that's structure, not weather. And once you know that, two questions, asked together, do the rest of the work. Will you regret staying if this doesn't change in 6 months? And would this specific problem follow you to the next job regardless of where you go? That's the whole decision, laid out honestly, with both paths costing something real, and neither one dressed up as the brave one. If this helped you see your own situation a little more clearly, that's genuinely the whole point of this channel. Take a second to subscribe, and we'll keep taking apart the decisions that actually shape a career, one honest episode at a time.